Turn to the book of James, and we're going to be in James chapter 3. I have been in church work for a very long time now, and I haven't traveled around that much. I've only started and pastored two churches, and now I'm pastoring here. So really, I've only been in leadership in three different churches, and here for the shortest of times. But I've had many friends who've spent their lives in ministry, and of course, we talk a lot, and you hear things. James, in his book, is extremely practical, and he talks about what genuine faith looks like. Now, in chapter 1, he said that genuine faith endures the most difficult of trials. And he talked about what it is to endure trials and why that's important. In chapter 2, James tells us that faith actually lives the truth. It acts on what it believes. In other words, Christians, those who've come to saving faith in Christ, aren't those who just hear the word, but there's those who also do the word. And he encouraged those who were reading his letter to follow through with that in their Christian life. In chapter 3, he starts talking about the practicality of the way we talk to one another, the things that we say. In fact, in chapter 3, we'll summarize in just a moment, he described the tongue with a number of metaphors, and one of them is a fire that can set the whole life in flames. And we know that. We've all participated in those conversations or heard about them or been on the receiving end. But James talks about just practical things. Church comes down to real practical experiences. In the section we're going to look at today, James talks about why sometimes I think the tongue is hard to tame. He says, we can tame every kind of animal that you can imagine, but taming the small little organ in between our teeth is sometimes quite a challenge. And in the section we're going to look at today, I think he suggests why that is. And I think he talks about every church. He talks about struggles that we have, not just with our tongue, but struggles that we have with our ego. And he uses very pointed language to challenge believers to think differently about their experience in church. So that's where we're going, and we're going to be in chapter 3, starting at verse 13. Before we do that, though, let's talk a little bit about what we talked about last week. He did talk about the tongue. The tongue is the source of conflicts. And I'll drill a little bit deeper down, then the problem that we have internally is what energizes the tongue to say the things that it says sometimes. James, I think, wants to get at the root of it, but he talks about the tongue being a common struggle for everybody, and the problem with it is that it's a matter of character. It's calling on us not to be the kind of well that tries to have both bitter and fresh water, because springs don't work like that. And it shouldn't work that way with us either. And James makes the statement that some things are happening among Christians that should not be. So today, or in the passage we're going to look at today, he talks about the source of the kinds of disorder that happens sometimes in congregations that provide the opportunities for the tongue to just run uncontrolled. And it does. Funny how people approach church. Years ago, back when Boyd and I were in a church together, back in the 70s and the 80s, I was a Bible college student at a local church that had a Bible institute. And so we talked about ministry all the time. And, when you're going in ministry, you're perfectly aware that churches sometimes erupt into disagreements, we'll call them. It's not a secret at all. Everybody who's in the business knows that these kinds of things happen. And so sometimes we were wont to talk about disagreements and how they're handled in church. And we would talk about why disagreements erupt and how bad sometimes it gets. There was an illustration of a church somewhere in Kansas. I don't think I ever knew where this church was. But it became just sort of it became the example of how you don't want things to go in church. Churches sometimes split, right? That means that some people go over here, they go over here, and some church splits, people go in 3 or 4 different directions at once, leaving just a few at home, and that kind of thing has been happening, forever and ever. This particular church, though, split, and it split over an issue that I don't know if you've ever heard before. I will tell you right now that it's no longer an issue. No one in any church would ever bring it up today, because it's gone now. And that's the way with most issues, honestly, right? They're there for a while. It seems like a really big deal, and then it goes away. And sometime you meet and you go, I can't believe that we used to actually think that was an issue. This church split over whether or not women should wear open-toed shoes to worship. The scandal. Open-toed shoes. Ladies, if you have open-toed shoes today, I want you to raise your hand. I'm just kidding. Don't raise. Well, I guess we know about the spirituality of First Baptist Church now, don't we? Well, that just figures. Ladies, we want all of you to meet us in the foyer after the service, and we're going to have a quick little meeting. You start your own church where people are allowed to do that kind of thing. You know, people have all kinds of ideas about church and how it should be and the way things should happen. In the passage we're going to look at today, James talks about a kind of wisdom that drives people to have opinions about things and ultimately, I think, drives them to say things they shouldn't. And the problem is the kind of wisdom that generates their thought process in the first place. And he has some words for what it is. He describes for us what this kind of wisdom looks like. Let's just start reading a little bit in chapter 3 and verse 13. And we'll read for right now to verse 18. It's not a very long passage. I may have to stop and make some comments as we go. Who among you is wise and understanding? By his good conduct, he should show that his works are done in the gentleness that comes from wisdom. But if you have bitter envy, there's phrase 1, and selfish ambition, there's phrase 2, in your heart, don't boast and deny the truth. Don't deny that you have it. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but its descriptions earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Verse 16, for where there is envy and selfish ambition, there's disorder in every evil practice. But the wisdom from above is pure, peace-loving, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering and without pretense. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who cultivate peace. So, James here, first of all, talks about the source of disorder. And I think the reason it came up is because he was talking about the issue of the tongue. And when he first starts talking about the issue of the tongue and the way we communicate in church, what's the first thing he says? Probably not many of you should be teachers. The construction, I don't know if you remember, it's possible that James was saying that a lot of you should stop trying to be teachers. There may have been a degree of social notoriety and status that came with being the guy on stage. And in these early churches, people were kind of seeking that kind of notoriety. It's possible that that was going on. At any rate, James says that not that many should seek to be teachers because they will receive the greater judgment. Now, in verse 13, when he says, who among you is wise and understanding, he may be hailing back to those people. Who are those in your congregation who claim to be sophoi? You know, we get the word sophistry from it. The idea that they were wise may imply that they were the people who were esteeming themselves to be teachers in the congregation. And James says, you know what? If you think you're the one that needs to be on stage, if you think you're the one that needs to be a teacher, then he says, then it's your good conduct that should promote you and not your technical expertise necessarily. Not that there's not a place for that, there certainly is. But James says that those who want to be teachers will be held to a greater judgment, not just because of the content of their messages and of their lessons and the things they say on stage, but also because of the deportment of their lives, the way they carry themselves. And he uses a couple words. He says that by his good conduct, he should show that his works are done in the gentleness that comes from true wisdom. Almost as though he's saying, you're wise? Okay. Well, what does your life look like? And he uses the word conduct, which is a common word that occurs all throughout the New Testament, describing the way someone lives their lives. And the danger of teachers is not only in their teaching and in the content of what they say, but the danger of teachers is that they're not living out what they say and they're just talking about it and sort of duplicitous, and that they don't follow through with what they tell everybody else they should be doing, things that they communicate to everybody else. Nobody wants that. Nobody wants somebody who gets up and tells me, you should, when his life is just a rampant mess. Sadly, there are many stories like that. Many ministers, the New Testament standard is that somebody whose name is associated with scandal is not what Paul would refer to as above reproach, and he shouldn't be on stage. James is really kind of falling in line with what Paul would say about the pastorate. There's some standards for who should be up there doing that. And he sort of appeals to that. And the word that he uses to describe is kind of interesting. He says if somebody wants to be the wise person, if he wants to be the teacher, if he wants to be the font of wisdom, then he says that he should show by his good conduct, that by works done in gentleness, that his wisdom is the right kind of wisdom. So he appeals to this word gentleness. Sometimes you'll see the word meekness and a couple of other words that translate it, but this word is interesting. In fact, one of the standard Greek lexicons says this about it. It's the quality of not being overly impressed by a sense of one's self-importance. Sounds a little like Paul. Paul said that no one should think more highly of himself than he ought. There shouldn't be this, what we call idealistic distortion about self, right? This inflated sense of grandeur because a guy is on stage shouldn't be characteristic of the person who's a teacher. Instead, he should be gentle. Other words that translate this are humility, courtesy, considerateness, and meekness. The word that some people say describes power under control. And it's under control for a reason, because of the values that the person carries. So James says if you want to be a teacher, that's fine, and you have a degree of knowledge, then that's fine. But the fact is, teachers are held to a greater standard, and the greater standard is that their character, and not just their words, are being watched by everybody. So this is where the practicality comes in. This isn't just about, the pastor needs to be degreed, and he needs to be lettered, and he needs to be careful, and his language needs to be scrubbed. It's not about that. This is about the character of the individual. This really sounds a lot to me like 1 Timothy chapter 3, when Paul says somebody wants to be an elder, here are the qualifications, and virtually none of them are technical. They're all character-driven. That's how you pick a pastor. It has to do with his character. I mean, we'll sit around and stew forever about the kind of degrees and the institution he has it from and how much of this he's done and how much of that he's done. But the real issue is the character of the individual. That's almost everything that Paul had to talk about when he talked about an elder. He does say he needs to be able to teach. Then everything else is a long list of character qualifications for the pastor. Sometimes we kind of reverse that. We think about everything else first and the character later. And that's sad. James here brings it all home and he says, you can be a teacher if you want to, he says, but the stuff that you teach needs to have changed who you are. It needs to have affected how you carry yourself. It needs to have affected the tongue. So let's read on. He says, but, and now he's going to draw a contrast. The one who wants to teach, or those who claim to be wise, should live their lives in a way where their belief system affects how they interact with other people so that this person is a gentle person. But, in verse 14, if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't deny it, don't boast, and deny the truth. This kind of wisdom that I'm talking about, he says, now he's going to clarify. The kind of wisdom I'm talking about is not from above, and there he means, heaven. It's not from God. But instead it's earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. So James is painting a picture now of an earthly kind of wisdom that should not characterize certainly those in leadership, but it also shouldn't characterize anybody in the congregation. And he uses a couple of words to describe the character or the disposition of the kind of people that he's talking about. The first phrase is bitter envy. Now, envy isn't necessarily a vice, because the Greek word means it means to be zealous for something, right? So to be passionate about something, to be motivated about something, and you can be motivated or passionate about something good. But the little word that occurs with it gives you a clue he's not talking about a virtue. Bitter envy. So imagine somebody who has passion and zeal for something, but it's characterized by bitterness. So this is somebody who's impassioned or excited or motivated about something that is bad. It's a negative kind, if you will, of jealousy. In fact, one writer said this: it's a fierce desire to promote one's own opinion to the exclusion of those of others. It's a factious spirit of somebody in the church. He's zealous, perhaps in a sense jealous. His character in this regard is bitter. And he's divisive in spirit in the way he interacts with other people. Now, whether James here is just talking about leadership or whether he's talking about the congregation at large, the effect is the same. What he's going to say is that you have all kinds of disorder in the body and in the leader, or certainly in the leadership, but in the body, when this kind of bitter jealousy drives people to promote their own agenda. And this is where the tongue becomes a problem. I think he's drilling down deep to the psychology behind an angry tongue, a tongue that lashes out, a tongue that abuses people, that puts people down, that pushes too hard. He's going to say more about this. He says if you have this bitter envy and if you have selfish ambition, it's an interesting word in the New Testament. One scholar has said this: it's a word that's commonly used in settings of sectarian rivalry or partisan politics. Anybody ever hear anything about partisan politics? Well, the attitude in your friends when you talk about party politics is a lot like what James is talking about. Isn't that one topic at dinner that we go, nope, not here, right? The friends come over and everybody wants to talk about their favorite politician or what they really don't like in politics. What's going to happen? You know what's going to happen. The dinner's going to go and crash and burn. Everybody's going to be angry. There's going to be a little tension in the room. It's not the dinner you want. And that feel is what happens in conversations behind this person's character when he talks. So it's sometimes associated with sectarian rivalry or partisan politics. The image appears of people in angry competition, undermining one another, and each fighting for their own rights. And it's a far cry from the humility of wisdom that James talks about. Does this kind of thing happen in church? Selfish ambition? And bitter zeal, bitter jealousy? It does happen. Why though? What is behind it? What's the source of the kind of thinking that leads people to this kind of attitude? I think he talks about it. And I think he talks about when he says this. This kind of wisdom, and he uses 3 words, is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Let's talk about those just a little bit. And I think the first 2 words we can kind of get at. When he says that this kind of wisdom, it's not from above, so it's not from heaven, so that means it's from here. And he affirms that when he says it's earthly, right? He says this is sort of an earth-generated wisdom. It doesn't include God, and it doesn't include spiritual values. It's just my thinking about stuff. These are my conclusions. He says it's unspiritual. That's an interesting word that Paul uses a lot to contrast something that's spiritual to something that's unspiritual. And he's using the word unspiritual here. You could use the word natural. This is a kind of wisdom that's natural, and it's inferior because it originates with human thinking and not with God. It doesn't originate with God's revealed truth. It's not scriptural truth. It's personal truth. It's my views and my thoughts and what I think and what I want out of the moment. And James says it's out of this wellspring that this rivalry and this bitterness and this selfish ambition gives full expression in conversations. And it gets worse. He says, in fact, this is so much a problem in the church that I would say that this kind of wisdom is actually demonic. And James is setting this up. In fact, when we get to chapter 4 and verse 7, remember what James says? Resist the devil and he will flee from you. James is going to talk about the impact of the enemy on the thinking and on the life of the church and our response and what it needs to be to it. Well, so let's back up just a little bit. James is talking, I think, not just about leaders, but I think he's bleeding into a general discussion about the body overall, talking about the tongue, how it needs to be controlled, and we all have struggles with it. Because you have people who could be leaders, but if they think they can be leaders, then maybe they should prove that their lives demonstrate a kind of gentleness that care about the thoughts and the need of other people, because the kind of wisdom that doesn't come from above thinks about, here it is, my thoughts my desires, my interests, my conclusions, what I want, what I think should happen. This is damaging in church body life. It pushes, it demands, it insists. Sometimes it insults, sometimes it lashes out. I mean, the kind of things that James says about the tongue are very descriptive. He says that the tongue can be a restless evil full of deadly poison. It stains the whole body. It sets the course of life on fire and is itself set on fire by hell, which sounds a little bit like that demonic thing that he was talking about. The influence of the enemy, even on the way I talk. So James is saying there's a kind of wisdom that contrasts to the wisdom by which God wants his church to operate. It's the kind that doesn't start with God and his desire for the church. Instead, it's earthly. It starts with me. Open-toed shoes? Are you kidding me? Where in the world, in the Bible, is open-toed shoes? Do you understand that in the first century, they probably didn't wear shoes? Should have kicked all those women out. You're not coming in here with your feet bare, woman. Go to the church down the street. They allow that kind of thing. And then what James is saying is all this infighting and all this nasty conflict from believer to believer starts at the base of human wisdom that has no connection to what God has to say about his church. It's just you. It's a thought that you had. You made it up. I had a professor who used to say, you're sucking that out of clean air. It doesn't come out of the Bible. I have all these ideas about church and how it should go, and I'm sucking them out of clean air because there's no chapter and verse to back me up. This is what we used to say when we were young, and I'm starting to pull it out of mothballs. When we were 13 and we'd have debates about things, you're trying to be theological. At 13, it's a little rough. And when you're having debates and you're young, sometimes your debates generate to this or degenerate to this. Nuh-uh, nuh-uh, nuh-uh. It's not a good debate, but it's all you got when you're 13. And so you go with it. Well, when you bump up a little bit and you're in church and you're having those debates, we used to say this to each other, and this was the showstopper. Oh, really? Chapter and verse. Remember that? Except it was more like this, chapter and verse. I'm starting to pull that dude out of mothballs because I think that's where James is going. We have a lot of ideas about what we think about church and about stuff. But where did it come from? In many cases, we're sucking it out of clean air. It has no connection to Scripture. It has no connection to theology. It has no connection to the history of the early church. It has no connection to what God has said. It has no connection to Ephesians chapter 4 or 1 Corinthians chapters 12 to 14. It's just me. And James says, that is not going to work. That's earthly. That's human wisdom. I don't know what was going on in the church. He doesn't tell us. He doesn't give us the presentation problem, right? Say, well, here's the debate that they were talking about. Probably wasn't open-toed shoes. I think we've established that. But there was something there. And James says the problem is not the issue. The problem is the people pushing. It's all about their agenda. It's about them. And church can't work like that. But there's another way to do this. In verses 17 to 18, he talks about heavenly wisdom. But the wisdom from above is pure, peace-loving, it's gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, it's unwavering, and it's without pretense. There's a lot that can be said about these. But notice how many of those words are relational. The wisdom that comes from above is gentle. It's peace-loving. But that's kind of a theme that James has in this section, by the way. It first wants peace in the relationship because it's seeking the good of the other person. It's not just looking to get its way. That's what selfish ambition is. I had a young man I was talking to this last week, and he said, well, what is selfish ambition? And I said, well, it's when you're only concerned about what you want in a context. And he said, well, when I'm playing a game, I want to win, so is that selfish ambition? And he was pushing me. I don't think he was being a hot dog. I think he really didn't understand where it starts and ends. He was looking for the borders, of selfish ambition. And I said, what? I think it's okay to to want your soccer team to win. I know everybody's thinking about that today. We'll get out of here in a minute. It's okay. I think it's okay to want to win, but what James is talking about is a kind of selfish ambition that sees one thing. That's all it can see. It doesn't think about the good of the other person because it has an end it wants. I want this. It doesn't matter what all these people, I want this. And this is what I believe, and it's not going to budge. It becomes agenda. And it's pushing and hard and driving, and it eventually becomes fast in the church. So this heavenly wisdom, it's pure and it's peace-loving and it's gentle and it's compliant. It's full of mercy and full of good fruits. It's unwavering, and the reason it can be unwavering is because it's not so subjective. I think. It's not subjective. I mean, if my wisdom starts first of all with God, then I can be unwavering in it. If my wisdom starts with me, then I'm going to vacillate, and maybe I'm not right, and I'm not sure, and everybody doesn't agree, and there's really nothing about this in Scripture, so this is just my opinion, and so I can kind of move back and forth, but this is unwavering because it comes from above. It starts with God. It doesn't start with me. So there's a whole different approach, and James says this approach to genuine wisdom should be the backdrop of conversations in the church. It should be the backdrop of the way we think about what we're doing and what our calling is together as a church and as believers. In verses 1 through 3, we have what I think is the source, or James describes as the source of wars. Now, by the way, look what he says about this. In verse 18, he says, "And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who cultivate peace." One person said this, "A crop of righteousness cannot be produced in the climate of bitterness and self-seeking. Righteousness will only grow in a climate of peace." James is promoting the peacemaking idea of the fellowship of believers. It is a theme elsewhere. James isn't wrong. He talks about taming the tongue. He's talking about modifying the purposes and the values of the speaker to be in line with what God wants. He goes on, and I'm going to move forward a little bit, just kind of priming the pump for next week. In verse 1 of chapter 4, he says, "What is the source of wars and fights among you? Don't they come from your passions that wage war within you? You desire, you don't have. You murder and covet, cannot obtain. You fight and wage war. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend it upon your pleasures." You know what James says here? Well, first of all, he calls them adulterous people. He says they're divided in their loyalties. He says, look, the reason that you fight one another is because you want certain things. There are two possibilities here. Number one, you don't ask for what you want. Take it to God. If it's in keeping with His will and His revealed will for what He wants for the church, Scripture tells us a number of times that God He'll grant the things that we ask if they're in keeping with His will. Another possibility is you've gone to God and you say, well, I have prayed. I've prayed and prayed over about it. He says one of the reasons you don't have when you ask is because you ask, how does he say it here? He says you ask with wrong motives. That's actually one Greek word, an adverb. It means badly. He says you don't have when you ask because you ask badly. Did you know that you can pray badly? There's actually bad praying. I had a prof when I was in seminary. He would ask somebody at the first of the year, who would like to open us in prayer? And a very pious and spiritual young student would say, I will. And he would pray. And when he was done praying, the professor would look up and he would say, he'd go to the board like this, and he'd grab a piece of chalk, which dates me. And he would say, would you mind terribly if I wrote what you just said on the board? And the stunned student would say, and then he would write some phrase from the prayer on the board. And he'd say, I'm wondering what you meant by this. You know, later on into the year, then people would say, he'd say, who would like to open the class in a word of prayer? Everybody would do this. And there were some students who were like, you can't analyze my prayer. You can't touch that. That's just, you're not welcome there. And it's wrong to analyze prayer, you know, and I get all that. But James says, it is possible to pray badly. And he says, bad prayers is when somebody with selfish ambition comes into prayer and prays for what they want for themselves. We'll talk more about this next week. But James says, look, Problem is, you want all kinds of things, and you don't know how to handle it spiritually. You can ask God for it, and if it's in keeping with His will, then He'll grant it. And if you ask for it and you don't get it, it may be that you have selfish ambition, and it's all about you. And James says this is demonic wisdom. This is evil. Actually, the fact is, evil prayer is prayer that serves personal desires. We do it all the time, don't we? And James says it's indicative, it's evidence of selfish ambition. So the wisdom that's from above, and let's stop with that, verse 17 again. It's pure, it's peace-loving, it's gentle, compliant, it's full of mercy, it's full of good fruits, it's unwavering, and it's without pretense. Now there's the mark of a body of people who love one another. That's stuff we've seen here, and stuff that I hope that we'll continue to see here. Why can't the tongue be tamed? Because the heart desires too much. And the heart that desires too much eventually demands too much. And the heart that believes that it has a right to demand too much infects everybody. A heart that's insisting that it is right when it has no biblical warrant affects everybody. Causes damage, darkness, disorder, James says, and every evil practice. So let's seek that wisdom that's from above